Hi, I'm Rachel Kramer Bussell, editor-in-chief of Residence 11, a website and community that celebrates sensuality, romance, intimacy, and loving in a new age of human connection. And you can find more about us and all our amazing content at residence11.com. And in advance of our first live event happening February 11th, the Desire Summit, the Residence 11 Desire Summit on Sex and Relationships, we're speaking with Sierra Simone. And you can find out more about the summit at summit.residence11.com. It's being held live in person in Los Angeles. So if you have Sierra's books, you want to get signed or want to buy them, or hear all of our amazing speakers, please come in LA. But we will also be live streamed around the world. So if you're anywhere else or can't make it, you can watch live. So let me tell you a little bit about Sierra. Sierra Simone is a USA Today and Wall Street Journal bestselling former librarian who spent too much time reading romance novels at the information desk. Her notable works include Priest, American Queen, and Misadventures of a Curvy Girl, and her books have been featured in Marie Claire, Cosmopolitan, Entertainment Weekly, and BuzzFeed. And this is not in her official bio, but she also has a book I'm going to be telling you more about, A Merry Little Meet Cute, co-authored with Julie Murphy, that came out at the end of last year. And she lives with her husband and family in Kansas City. You can find out more about her at thesierrasimone.com. So we're going to be talking for about 20 or so minutes. And if you have questions and are watching, you can comment where you're watching this, and we'll try to get to them or get to them afterwards. And Sierra is going to be on a panel about writing the modern romance novel at Desire Summit with fellow romance authors Mia Hopkins, Suzanne Park, and Angie Williams, and it's moderated by Kelly Reynolds of the Boobies and Newbies podcast. So you definitely want to check that out. It's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, so make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're watching this so you can catch our upcoming interviews. And now we're going to jump right in. So, Sierra, I want to go back before we get to your writing career, which is very vast and varied, to those early days reading romance. Who was the first romance author you read, and how did you get into romance? And then what was your path from being a reader to becoming an author?
Well, I think I had kind of a sideways door into reading romance because I didn't start out sort of jumping right into romance. And I do remember really vividly when I was like 11 or so, my step grandma came up to me one day and she had like a brown grocery bag full of Harlequin romances. And I mean like full, like they were like stacked like two deep, like two side by side. There was probably 30 or 40 books in that one bag. And she's like, I have like 7 bags of these in the guest bedroom. Take as many as you want home. And I remember kind of looking at the covers and immediately intuiting that there were like no dragons or vampires anywhere in there. And that's primarily what I was interested in. I think 11 was probably still like tail end of my Animorphs days. And I was like, so none of them change into animals. So I was like, no, thanks. I'm good. They're just people in jeans. Like, like what's that story? So I look back at that and I'm like, man, my life would have been really different if I would have taken that bag of books. But instead, I really read books that aren't categorized as romances, but stirred a lot of romantic feelings in me. So, like Interview with the Vampire, Clan of the Cave Bear, lots of V.C. Andrews, lots of Stephen King, lots of books about King Arthur. And all of these stories, Jane Eyre, all of these stories had like really powerful romantic themes, but they weren't traditional romances and that there generally isn't a happily ever after. There might be one at the end of the Clan of the Cave Bear series. I don't remember. um, and so it wasn't really until I was a young mom and someone had given me that Sylvia Day series with the cufflinks on the cover
Mhm.
that I read sort of my first, I guess, contemporary romance. And after reading that, like I think I was just ready for it. I was ready for that kind of story that was told on the scale of normal people who aren't vampires or aren't living 40,000 years ago. And I was just really ready for it. And it was really, at the time, I was writing young adult dystopian fiction, which is very heavily influenced by romance. The romance subplot is not even a subplot. I mean, it is the primary plot of the stories. And so for me, like, it felt like a really natural segue to start like flexing my fingers into writing romance. But one of the things that I loved about it was like what I loved about fan fiction when I used to read fan fiction in high school and college was that romance was like iterative. Like, people would find an archetype that they really liked or a theme that they really liked. And then there was no like, well, you've written about this one character archetype once. I guess that's your one brooding hero story that you get. Now you have to find something new. No, in romance, authors can be like, I write only brooding heroes. I write
Mhm.
only tortured Navy SEALs. I write only grumpy sunshine. And that freedom to just be like, no, these are the things I like, and I'm just going to do it over and over again. And every time I do it again, I'm going to find something new and exciting about this kind of story was amazing, especially coming from young adult, where at the time I was writing in like the early teens, there definitely was this feeling of you need to bring something new to the genre. Like, every YA book needs to be sort of bringing a new kind of story to this genre. And it was so nice to go to a genre where it's like new is fine and good, but like we also love the things we love and we can't get enough of them. Like, if you ever meet a reader who's just discovered a new trope that they love, they're not like, well, I'm done with blue aliens because I read one blue alien book I like. They're like, no, give me 23 blue alien books right now.
I love that. And I think it's so true, especially in romance, also in erotica. It's, I mean, and I imagine, like, I was thinking of those bags of paperbacks, I assume like category type, those thin Harlequins. I mean, people read those every month and they'll read every one or every one in the type of book that they want. And I mean, I feel like the romance readers I know, the really avid ones, people I've met at conferences, I mean, they want more and more and more, to the point where, from what I understand, some authors, you can't keep up with the demand. So there really isn't that problem. And as I say that I read romance, I also read cozy mysteries, and same thing. Like, I'm not looking for someone to reinvent the wheel. I want things I want out of that. And I think you're right that within romance there are so many subgenres, and some people only read one, and some will read like an author across subgenres or whatever. So actually, I don't know the answer to this. I'm not sure which novel was your first novel, but can you tell us, well, which novel was your first novel and how that specific plot and path came to you?
Yeah. So, firstly, I'm going to apologize because it does look like the trash truck is right
No
outside my
problem.
house. So, if you hear a dull roar, it is the trash truck, not my like empty, ready for lunch stomach. Um, but my first book was The Awakening of Ivy Leavold, which is actually a historical romance. It's historical erotica, which is not like the most happening subgenre of books. But it came about very organically, and it was so it wasn't like an intentional decision in the sense that I'm going to move genres. What's the strongest genre that matches to my skills? No, it was not that thought out. I was working on these young adult books, which are published under a different name, and I was really struggling to kind of connect my writing process to the way that New York publishing was working in YA at that time, which was very driven by high concept stories, and very driven to sort of like action kind of stories. And I was really kind of struggling to find my voice again. And so I had a friend who said, why don't you try writing something just for yourself, something that you're not going to try to pitch to an editor or an agent, that is kind of hemmed in by all of these commercial concerns about what your follow-up project will be. And by that point, I had pitched so many things and been told so many, given so many rejections, that I was really kind of in a place where it's like, I think that I'm not good at writing. Like, I think that I'm not good at having ideas because all the people around me are telling me like, no, this idea isn't good enough. It's not good enough. It's not big enough. And so this friend was like, well, just write something for yourself and for your immediate friends, like just share something fun with us. And so I naturally wrote fan fiction of Jane Eyre. The kids are really clamoring for Jane Eyre fan fiction. Um, but I have loved Jane Eyre since I was 11 or 12, and the 2011 movie of Jane Eyre with Michael Fassbender as Rochester is just like chef's kiss. So I started writing these sort of like spicy in between scenes, like, these scenes that sort of happen after the kiss and Jane Eyre, when the camera fades to black. And I kind of would keep the scenes going. And I had so much fun doing that, my friend was like, why don't you just turn this into like an original fiction, something, an original story to you, but capture what it is that you love about this Jane Eyre fanfic so much. And I was like, okay, I love a hero where maybe he's going to kill you and you don't know. I like the sort of brooding widower vibes. I like a gothic manor house. And so all of that sort of pulled together into the story that became the Markham Hall series, and The Awakening of Ivy Leabold was the first one. And I kind of knew from the beginning that I didn't want to fuss with trying to find a publisher for it. Like, historical erotica is such a small subgenre. It's not something that a lot of publishers are looking for. I knew that it was a little bit rule breaky in the sense that like Mr. Markham is probably pretty dangerous for a traditional romance hero. And there's a lot of I would say that it flirts very heavily with polyamory, which was something that, especially at the time when I was writing it in 2014, I didn't know that a publisher would be super on board with, and something I didn't want to change. So I was like, I'm going to self-publish this. I've never self-published before. So all you got to do is just think of a name, right? And then just put it on like KDP. At that time, this was the very early days of Kindle Unlimited. So you got paid per borrow, not per page read. And so I was like, that's what I'll do. I'll just make up a name. And then I did in 5 minutes. It's my middle name and the name of the street I grew up on. And was like, okay, registered domain name for sierrasimone.com. And then I put it up on KDP Select. And that was the beginning of Sierra Simone. And I never would have known that that was like going to be my main career. I think if I'd known that like I would only be writing as Sierra Simone in the future, I probably would have put more thought into the name, but here we are.
I love that story. I had to mute myself because my fridge is making ice right now.
Oh.
So I think that's all very interesting. And I do just want to say to anyone watching this who's an aspiring romance author, or really any kind of aspiring author, that I found really inspirational. I think a lot of people give up at a certain stage of rejection or feel like, okay, my books or writing doesn't fit this type of guidelines or publishing strictures. And now you're hugely successful. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later. Some of your self-published books are now being published by traditional publishers. And, you have a huge audience eager for your books, but I feel like it's hard to know that, or it's hard to know that's going to happen. And obviously no one can know that's for sure going to happen. But I think the point was that I took away was don't give up. So I do want to talk about some of your audience because, I've been reading your work for, I don't know, 5 years. I don't know. I had started to hear about American Queen on a lot of Facebook groups for romance authors, but in the time since then, in the last few years, maybe 2 years, you've gotten a lot of attention on TikTok, and I know that's impacted, broadening your audience. Can you talk about sort of how that evolution has happened of specifically book talk, finding your books, and what that has meant for your career, and yeah, and that, and I also sort of totally separate question, but I don't want to forget, has the audience interest and feedback changed at all your approach to writing, or your approach to like what kinds of subgenres you write? Because I know you don't do historical now, or most of your books are contemporary. So I know you've expanded beyond that. So I'm curious, like, how do you? I guess maybe the question is, how do you pick what kind of books you're going to write next?
Well, okay, so I'll answer that one first. I really think that so much of I think that a real goal for an author's career should not be pinned to any one act as when you're an aspiring writer, it's really easy to let a goalpost kind of become the goal in and of itself. And then you get to the goal, like getting an agent or getting a book deal, or this doesn't exist anymore, apparently, but hitting the USA Today bestseller list. You get to a goalpost, and it's so easy for that to become the goal that when you get to that point, it's sort of like, oh, I don't know what happens next. So for me, I really had to reframe over time, what did I want out of my author career? And I realized that that I want to be here in 10 years. And when that is sort of the end of the equation and you're solving for why, for me, why means that I have to be creatively fulfilled, or I won't be here in 10 years. I will burn out, or all the other hard parts of publishing will sort of crawl up and swallow the good things that I get out of this vocation. And so knowing that that's my why, that I have to be creatively fulfilled, does give me some good metrics for what I choose to write. That said, the pressure of what the market wants, what the market is hungry for in the moment, that's a real pressure. And I don't think pressure has to be a pejorative thing. Like, pressure is good. Like, pressure creates currents and creates streams, and like, there's something really wonderful about knowing or intuiting market demand, and knowing that readers are hungry for this kind of story right now. I got really lucky in 2015 when I published Priest. It wasn't on purpose, but it was a time when the market was really hungry for taboo romance. And I happened to have a taboo romance at the right time. So there is something great about that pressure, right? Like, it's responsive. And knowing that your books are landing and finding, oh, sorry, it's my old friend, potential spam, calling me. So knowing that your audience is wanting something is really good, and it gives you a good sense of like, what's going to land the strongest, what can I do with my time that will land the best. But that pressure does have to be counterweighed with, like, does this story speak to me right now? And for my pre-series, I've always been pretty like, careful not to use that premise as sort of clickbait, I guess. Like, I don't want any of the priest books, which are, all of them are about people, kind of their lives are intersected with the Catholic Church. I don't ever want that to sort of be this the sort of shock value of the premise being what's drawing readers in. I want there to be a really deep and spiritual story behind it. But in order for that to happen, in order for me to write something that has its teeth or its roots into something deep and spiritual, it's a really intimate kind of storytelling. And it means that something in me has to be ready to tell that story. So it's really hard for me. It would be really hard for me to sit down and write a priest book every single year, because not enough inside of me has changed or developed or started asking new questions about interior life to justify writing a book with that premise. Like, I really feel like I need to bring something to back up the sort of shock value of, here's a priest who falls in love, or here's a monk who falls back in love with his ex-boyfriend. Like, I need to have that. I need to back up that premise. So for me, in the priest books, like, they come out like once every 3 years, because I have to be ready to tell that story, and I have to have the right story to match the kind of forbidden and liminal value of what I'm promising with the premise. And so that's a hard balance, right? Because Priest, that series is a series where I have readers that are saying, I want more. I want the next book. I want the next book. And I have to say, no, I'm not ready to write it yet. And know that maybe by the time I am ready to write it, the interest will have waned, the demand will have slackened. And that's a trade-off that I have to navigate. But for me, the creative value, the artistic value of waiting and making sure it's the right story is necessary. And so I guess that I don't really have an answer to this, but the answer is that with each project I choose, I am balancing, what makes the most sense for me right now for a career, for being an author who's working in conjunction with readers to make sure that these stories are landing right, that they're finding the right people. And then what is the best story choice for me as an individual artist who's using romance as a way to ask questions of myself and of life in general. And so each project is kind of like me toggling different switches between the two to see kind of what's the right fit. But speaking of audiences, as to your first question about TikTok, so TikTok is amazing. But I will be the first to say I don't spend a lot of time on social media. Um, Not because I'm a Luddite necessarily, but because I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And I also have narcolepsy. And so my bandwidth is kind of shrunk on a daily basis. So I don't tend to get on social media a lot. So I didn't know that Priest was big on TikTok until like the third or fourth month. I really started seeing sales lift for no reason that I could see. I wasn't running any ads or anything. And someone finally sent me a TikTok and they were like, "Do you know people have found Priest on TikTok?" And I was like, wow, like it by that point it was a 5-year-old book. Now it's, almost 8 years old, this book. And so the fact that social media can take an 8-year-old book and be like, you should read this, and make it relevant again, I think is something incredibly beautiful and really speaks to the power of word of mouth. This is one of the things that I tell young authors a lot is that, there's no replacing word of mouth. You can have the best newsletter strategy, you can have incredible advertising strategy, but it is word of mouth that will really connect people to your readers. As a former librarian, I can say that most often it wasn't covers or titles or jacket copy that sold a book to a patron. It was me, the librarian, saying, "Oh my gosh, you have to read this. This was the twistiest mystery I've read in years." That kind of person to person evangelizing really is, I think, what sells books. And TikTok has captured that in a way that I don't think any other social media entirely has captured it, which I think is amazing. And what it's really done is it's brought a new and younger audience to my books, which is also incredible. And so it's really exciting to see people who are just coming out of maybe reading YA, people who are in their early 20s, and they're just discovering, sort of the beautiful meadows of romance for the first time. It's really great. The caveat is that I will say Book Talk, TikTok itself has an algorithm that's biased. And so that's coded into TikTok's For You page, right? Is this biased algorithm. And then Book Talk itself, is expressing the natural biases that are endemic to romance. And so the books that have benefited the most from Book Talk typically are white, straight, cis, able-bodied books. And so that is sort of I think the underbelly of Book Talk is that white authors in particular have seen benefits from this platform that authors of color have not. And so I think it's something that I see a lot of people advocating to change. And I hope that change spreads, but it is definitely there.
That's really interesting. What was I was going to say? I think something that's interesting is that, and I don't get to many in-person bookstores these days myself, but I see photos of them online. I follow tons of bookstores, and I see, popular on Book Talk at bookstores, and it's just always funny to me. I don't know why. Not that they shouldn't be popular or bookstores shouldn't capitalize on that, but just I think I guess I feel old in the sense that when I was a teenager or early 20s, that we didn't have social media. So I had to just go by either word of mouth, like you said, or go to the bookstore and look at what was new. And I didn't have that community. And I think it's not that I'm jealous because I can access it too now, but it's really cool. I think that people have it. And like we were saying before with the subgenres, if you have that niche that you love, whatever it is, you can find it, and then you can also find other people who share it.
Yes.
So you touched on polyamory a little bit in your answer about your first novel, but I want to talk about that and that a lot of your books have queer plot lines, and specifically, like one of my favorites, Misadventures of a Curvy Girl, has both. And so I would love to know, because you write male female, you write male male, you write male male female. Can you talk about your approach to writing about queer love and sexuality and why that's important to you and how you know, how it's been incorporated into your work so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I wish that I had an intellectual answer for this, but it really is kind of an intuitive, organic process for me. And I think that there are a lot of authors who sort of are writing from maybe a more outer layer of themselves, and I think those books are amazing. Like, so this is not a pejorative, right? Like that there's some sort of high art and low art depending on like kind of what layer of yourself you're writing from. I don't buy into any of that, but I do think that for me when I'm writing, I'm really sort of pulling from my bone marrow when I write. And My bone marrow is queer. So the stories sort of organically evolve into the way that I understand sex, the way that I understand love, which is fundamentally queer. And I think that is also a recursive process because it's through writing through the last 8 years. I mean, really like 9 if we count when I really started writing Markham Hall, that I have been, writing characters who are queer. And then that in turn has helped me understand my own queerness better. And so it is this like feedback loop, where using the text really helps me understand myself better and helps me understand desire better every time I write a story. And I hope that it's the same for readers. I know I feel that way as a reader, that every time I read a book, especially a really powerful one, it helps me excavate something of myself. And even if that's just a tiny sliver, even if that's just a tiny sliver of myself, every book I read helps me understand more about myself and the people around me. There's this like study that they've done. I think it's actually a series of studies where they've shown that when you're reading fiction in like an MRI machine, your brain is lighting up with what you're reading. So not just the part of your brain that processes words and language, that's not the only part that's lighting up. If you're reading about a character eating food, for example, then the parts of your brain that are understanding taste and smell and texture are lighting up. If you're reading about a character kicking their leg, then the part of your brain that controls kicking your leg lights up. And so your brain is actually not super sophisticated when it comes to separating fiction from real life. And so when you are reading a book, you really are having a full scenario of empathy. You are in like an empathy gym, building up your empathy. And that I think is so powerful as a reader. It's what I crave. But I also find that as a writer too. Like each time I write, I am working out my empathy and building myself out as a human being even more, or incarnating into myself fully is what I probably should say. So that I think that it's a process that comes naturally. And what I did find was, when I really first started publishing in the beginning of 2015, it was it was it was a slightly different environment. And I will say, like when I published American Queen in 2016, which was my first really overtly polyamorous book. It's flirted with in my historicals, but in American Queen, that's the central storyline, is a polyamorous storyline. The response I got from the two men in that triangle, that menage being queer, was pretty negative. So I had a lot of readers who really liked it, and then I did have a lot of readers who were really homophobic about it. And now in 2023, I am so blessed that I can publish, anything, and my readers are here for it. So I write FF, I write MM, I wrote Thornchapel, which is like MMMFFF. And so the beauty, I think, for a writer is that if you are writing yourself, your identity, if you're writing along the liminal, if you keep doing it, I find that you do build a destination. You do start building a readership who resonate with what you do. And so I couldn't have made any other choices in my storytelling choices, because unfortunately I am not as like cutthroat commercially as I would like to be. But the silver lining to maybe choosing stories that on the face of themselves weren't as commercial or mainstream as writing straight MF, is that over time I've built a readership who likes that, they like what I do. They like how I approach romance and desire. And so I it's hard to give advice to be like, "Yeah, you should do it." Just, just endure, fussy emails and bad reviews for years, but then it pans out eventually. But truly, I do think it does. The more honest you are with your own storytelling voice, the more your readers, the readers who are matched to your kind of storytelling from birth will find you.
I think that's so true, and that I think that transcends romance or any specific genre. Because I think often, like I'll talk to writers, and they're trying to kind of find a secret passageway to what will be hot, what should I write, and I really think, I mean, yes, you can look at the market trends and you can write to them, but I think if it doesn't come from somewhere inside you, like you were talking about, I think that shows in the writing. I mean, as a reader, so anyway. I mean, I guess that's debatable. But so speaking of the popularity of your books, and sort of that full circle resurgence, you self-published a lot of your titles, the earlier titles, the pre-series and the American Queen, right? First, and
Yes, yeah.
can you talk about now Bloom Books is republishing a lot of those, and then you also published last fall A Merry Little Meet Cute, which you co-authored with Julie Murphy. This is a totally separate book, but with Avon Books, and I'll ask about the writing of that. But I was curious, can you talk about both having done now both self-publishing and working with traditional publishers? Any thoughts about that? And you know, I guess like if someone's starting out, would you recommend they pursue a traditional publisher or self-publishing? Or I'm sure there's lots of factors, but I'd love to maybe hear more about that, because I think that's one of the big decisions people have to make. Like, do they spend a long time trying to get an agent and get published by a publisher, or do they take the quicker route to self-publishing?
I really think it comes down to 2 things, and the first thing I've always said, and then the second thing I'm stealing from my friend Tessa Gratton, because she said it, probably in, like, 2015, she and I were at an event, and she said this, and I was like, "Oh, that's really smart too." So 2 questions that I think any, about to be published author should ask themselves. The first is, what is the kind of book that you're writing? So for me, that has been the most informative question I've asked myself of any project. And I think that what is important to remember is that traditional publishing is a very large infrastructure. And because it is a large infrastructure, there is some rigidity to it. And so that rigidity means that traditional publishing really thrives when they are marketing a property that falls well into their bailiwick of what they like to do. So for example, like a rom-com, backstage, we were talking about Emily Henry, who's amazing, and I'm not at all jealous of because she's so talented and pretty and nice. Um, and she writes books that really fall into this perfect Venn diagram where women's fictions readers and then also romance readers really get everything they need out of her books. And so she is able to use that big infrastructure of traditional publishing to really get her books out there, to get them to as many readers as possible. And lots of readers are going to like them. I think murder mysteries, there are certain kinds of murder mysteries. Louise Penny comes to mind because the Three Pines TV show is out. Those were so popular when I was a librarian. They're the perfect kind of mystery for people who love mysteries because you have a small town, a recurring investigator kind of figure, and then lots of really interesting character work, in addition to everything you want out of a mystery, which is like good red herrings, good pacing, good twist at the end. And so when you have a property, a text that is really well within the sort of very rigid categories of what publishers like to publish, then there's a good chance that your book would really land well with their help, that they would be able to leverage their apparatus to their best extremes to help you. And so when Julie and I wrote A Merry Little Me Cute, there's a lot about it that's like a little bit out there. It's about an adult film star who is kind of semi-accidentally cast in this wholesome Christmas movie. And so there's a sex worker heroine. She's plus size. Both characters are bisexual. So there is a lot about it that I think, especially a few years ago, publishers might have been like, I'm not sure. But luckily, in this time in our kind of publishing history, the publishers were really excited about it. And we even as we were writing it, I was like, this would be so good with a traditional publisher, because it is just a really heartfelt rom-com at its core. It's just really funny and really sweet. And even though it is pretty dirty, there's only two people and none of them's a priest. So we won't be stretching a traditional publisher too far. And so we were like, okay, what is the kind of book I'm writing? That book does fit in with a traditional publisher very well. When it comes to, say, my Thornchapel series, which is polyamorous, queer, and kinky with 6 people in a Gothic manor house in present day England, and it's got human sacrifice, maybe, I don't know, pagan orgies. That was a story that I knew off the bat would have to be indie published, because it doesn't have any easy comps. It has a lot of barriers in terms of its taboos, and I really knew that I would know the best way to market it. I would know the best covers for it, the best way to package it with a blurb and a tagline, and how I wanted to approach messaging this story. I really trusted that I probably knew that better because it was such an individual story, and because it would have a smaller readership. And some people instinctively will hear oh, publishers can get books to millions of people. A smaller readership of maybe thousands, that's less good. But I always think it's much better to have a deeper destination filled with super fans than it is to be searching for a mainstream audience, where people are reading your books and then immediately forgetting that they read them. I don't want my books to find readers who are going to be reading it and be like, this isn't for me, and then never go on to read any of my other books. I want a reader to pick up one of my books and be like, yes, I've been waiting for this kind of story, and then immediately go to my backlist and read everything they can get their hands on. I want those kinds of readers. So I don't think smaller readerships are intrinsically bad at all. I think that especially if you have a project that is more liminal, more specific, maybe, that sometimes an indie situation is better, because you don't have to pay for a team of publicists and the people who clean the bathrooms at the HarperCollins offices or whatever. You don't have to support that huge infrastructure. You're only supporting yourself. So you can make bolder decisions. You can make more dangerous decisions. You can really try out something and see if it works. And then if it doesn't work, you can choose a new cover. You can rewrite the blurb. You can try a new ad set. So you're much more nimble on your own. And I think being more nimble usually fits maybe more specific or liminal projects. And so that is kind of usually my framework, is what's the project? And then I decide where it's going to fit best. The second question I would have an author ask themselves is, what kind of person are you? This I got from Tessa Gratton. And, she was sort of saying, not everyone really has the bandwidth, the energy, the ability to withstand lots of stress to self-publish a book, right? So it is a little bit trickier than just slapping your book up on Kindle Unlimited, right? It might not have been that way back in the day when they first started Kindle Unlimited. If you put your book in there, you might have a reasonable chance of finding some new readers. But now you do really have to approach it with a lot of thought and intention in terms of building a platform and starting to collect readers and build an ongoing readership. It is a job that encompasses marketing and accounting and creative thinking and a lot of stuff that in a traditional publishing situation, you're able to at least share with a whole team of people with a lot of experience and a lot of data to work with. So if you're someone who is like, the idea of being responsible for your own covers, your own blurbs, having to start a newsletter right off the bat, having to sort of hustle, if that sort of immediately makes you feel like, oh my gosh, that's overwhelming, then that's another reason to think about traditional publishing. If you are someone who's like, no, I kind of do want to be able to control that sort of thing. I want to be able to play with price point at a moment's notice. I want to be able to wake up and say, I want to try a new cover and then just be able to do it. That is, really the benefit of indie publishing.
I also think, for some people who kind of just want to do the creative work of the writing, that all the business side kind of freaks them out. And then there's other people who see a creative aspect maybe to the business side, or who just can do both. But I deal with a lot of writers who want to get into whether it's erotica or romance. And I think that they think it really is just, oh, well, I can self-publish, which I think that you can put a book available for sale in relatively short time, but that doesn't mean you're going to find an audience for it. And I think then you have to ask yourself, is it just about having it literally be available for sale, or do you want to reach a wider or as wide an audience as you could? So
Yeah, I would say yes. And you said something in there that I did want to pull out, and it's something that Sky Warren, who is a New York Times bestselling romance author and who also runs conferences and teaches classes about, marketing. She will say that marketing is a fundamentally creative act. And so I think that if you're someone who can look at marketing as that another kind of storytelling, like marketing, yes, incorporates data and uses data to make decisions and, runs lots of tests, but it is also like kind of an alchemical act. There's actually a book about marketing I really love called Alchemy. And it's all about how, people aren't typically using their rational brain to make decisions about what books they buy or what cereals they buy, or if they're going to go grab Starbucks right now. Like, that is a deeper, more organic decision making process. And marketing is always trying to sort of like entice that impulse buy, right? So like it is really creative. But yes, I would also say, like, if you're someone who's like, I just want to write, then indie publishing is being a small business owner. I compare it to like if you it would be like if you ran a coffee shop where you also like grew the coffee in your backyard, roasted it, and then like, turned it into coffee for people. So it is definitely becoming a small business owner, and it works best if you, just like a coffee shop, if you have it open over time, right? You don't open up a coffee shop and expect, to have full tables every day your first month. You have to be open for a while so that people know that you're there. And so it is, I think, sometimes can be a little bit of a longer game that's rewarded by knowing what's next. And so in romance, that's great because romance is a genre where readers love more and more. But I think it's always best to self-publish with a plan for the book that you can say, okay, this is next to the readers. So not just that they're buying a book that you just published, but that as soon as they get to the end of that book, you can say there's more on the way.
that's awesome. Thank you. So we're winding down. I have two more questions. One is sort of open ended, and you've largely given a lot of this advice, but you're speaking on our panel about writing the modern romance novel, and we have authors across self-publishing, traditional publishing, lesbian romance, sweet romance. It's going to be very interesting to hear just the range of types of romance and approaches people have had. But just speaking pretty broadly, is there anything else you can say in terms of advice for someone who's a romance reader and fan who either knows they want to write romance or thinks they has thought about it while reading, but like hasn't made that leap? Is there any encouraging words you have for them about how to get started?
I guess I have like anti-encouraging words, which are um I would caution anyone who's in that beginning stages, and I'm going to assume that with that exploration stage is coming with input, right? So you're probably looking at books about how to write a romance novel, or you're reading blog posts, or you're watching YouTube videos about it. And so what I would brace myself against is any advice that comes with a really strident or prescriptive tone. This really spun me in a lot of eddies when I was first getting started. I studied creative writing in college, but I also afterwards like immediately wanted to write YA novels and was just gobbling up all the advice I could about writing books. And what I didn't know at the time was that, when someone has a vested interest in becoming an expert, or when their experience comes from writing a very different kind of book, their advice might not always be applicable or as valuable, right? So if someone is, a self appointed expert, they probably are going to have a really prescriptive tone about how you should write a book, how this romance should start, where the beats should be. And all of that is fine general advice. And I think a good gut check, like if you're writing a book and you're like, I feel like nothing's happening. I'm going to go back and look at this, beat sheet and see, should I have had something happen here? That's a great gut check. But I do think that when advice gets very like formulaic, or not formulaic in the sense that books are formulaic, because I don't care about that. Like, I don't buy into that low art, high art stuff. Like, write a formulaic book. That's great. I love them. But when the advice itself is treating a fundamentally unformulaic process, which is the art of creation, like it's a recipe, I think that that only works for like 10 to 15% of authors. So I do think that there are people out there who thrive at recipe writing, who that gives them the structure they crave and they like something replicatable. And it really just gels with the way that they work. That's great. I don't like, they're going to do fine. They don't need me. But for everyone else who might just feel like they tried something and it only half worked, they're still looking for that one thing that's really going to unlock their ability to write. I would say the problem's not with you. It's with the idea that there's one right way to do anything. So that's like my one bit of anti-encouragement is be wary of anything that sounds super prescriptive, that this is the way a book should be. You have to do this to write a good book. I feel like that is not the point of books. And we could probably all point to a book that we read in the last month that we would be like, this breaks the rules. And I absolutely love it. And then my other piece of anti-encouragement is I always joke you can change your name and start over again, which is what I did. But I feel like within that joke, what I really mean is no one book has to bear the weight of perfection. So the book that you're working on now, it does not have to be perfect. It does not have to contain every thought about love and desire and sex that you've ever had. The great thing about romance is that it is an iterative genre, which means that you can write 20 books on the same theme and romance will welcome you and thank you for it. And so it's okay if one book isn't everything that you want the book to be, because you're going to write the next book. And in the next book, maybe you'll get a little bit closer to having it be everything you want to be. Or maybe you'll be able to say this part of one thing that you weren't able to fully encompass in the first book. And so like letting your work in progress be what it is without having to be this singular perfect whole, knowing that you probably have 10 or 20 books in you if you're going to write in romance for a while, I think is really freeing. Like, it's okay if this book isn't everything, because you're going to have more books where you can have your oeuvre be everything, not just one title.
I love that. I literally wrote down no one book has to bear the weight of perfection, because I think that's a hard lesson for a lot of people.
Yeah. Hard one, painfully learned.
So, what are you working on next? I know you have more. You have a novella in the works, another one with Julie Murphy. Can you tell us about that and any other projects you have going on?
Yeah, so Julie Murphy and I, last fall, we released a book called A Merry Little Me Cute. It's the one about the porn star who gets accidentally cast in a wholesome Christmas movie. And we have a spinoff novella coming out this July. It's Christmas in July. It's an MM novella about two characters from that book who are kind of having a little bit of a second chance romance situation on the set of a porn parody of Pretty Woman. And it's called Snow Place Like LA. And that's out in mid-July. And then there's the next book in our Christmas Notch series, the full-length book, which is about a woman who decides that she's going to star in kind of a spicy movie But she's kind of coming from purity culture. And when she gets to the set of the spicy movie, she realizes she's not very good at having like fake sex on camera, because she's never had real, like good sex in real life. And so her co-star helpfully, generously, because he cares about art, says, I will help you have good sex so that you can do it on the camera later. So that's called A Holly Jolly Ever After. By the way, the spicy movie is like a Santa Claus origin story called Santa Baby. It's all about Santa Claus sowing his wild oats, before he like takes on the reins of the sleigh. And so that is coming out in October. And in the meantime, I'm working on a spinoff of New Camelot, which is about, I don't know if anyone knows the legend of Mark, Tristan, and Isolde. This is a contemporary queer and kinky retelling of Mark, Tristan, and Isolde. And it's real messed up. I'm not gonna lie. I'm like writing this and I'm having such a great time. I'm like totally just like, I'm like in the sandbox, sand is flying, and I'm having so much fun. But I can tell that some people are going to be like, oh my God, romances should not do this.
I think that's a
I
good,
never followed that rule.
we want that to happen, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And everyone, please come hear Sierra and our other romance authors on February 11th in LA and streaming worldwide. Live streaming, visit summit.residence11.com to get your tickets to Desire Summit and find out more about Sierra at thesierrasimone.com.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.